Today's manuscript follows the grueling childhood and early adulthood of an orphaned girl as she navigates abusive relatives, a harsh charity school, and her first job as a governess at a mysterious estate. We are diving right into the critique to explore how we can elevate this incredibly evocative narrative.
Yeah, I am very ready to get into this. There is just so much raw power in these pages, and I really want to look at how we can, harness that energy without letting it totally run away from us.
Right. I mean, the material makes a really strong case for the protagonist's fiery nature right away, like by highlighting her intense early rebellions in the Red Room and against John Reed.
Oh, absolutely. The heat in those opening chapters is undeniable.
It is. But let's look closely at the section discussing the 8-year time jump in Chapter 10. Reading this part, it feels as though we've been watching a roaring, untamed fire, and then somebody simply flips a switch and it becomes a perfectly calibrated gas stove. I mean, we missed the turning of the dial.
Is the connection between A and B fully established in the material, or is that an area to potentially bolster?
Well, the abrupt 8-year time jump compresses a crucial period of the protagonist's emotional maturation into a mere passive summary.
Yes, exactly. That's the core weakness right there. Skipping directly from the aftermath of the typhus outbreak to her adulthood, it leaves the reader completely disconnected from the actual process of her transformation.
Right, we just jump forward.
Yeah, the narrative tells us that she, quote, imbibed Miss Campbell's nature and gave her allegiance to duty and order. But relying on exposition for such a massive character shift, it just flattens the emotional weight of her internal growth.
It really does.
The reader totally misses the vital struggle of this passionate, volatile child actively forcing herself into a, subdued, disciplined mold.
And I think we have to talk about what that exposition costs the reader emotionally. I mean, we spent chapter after chapter experiencing every physical blow from John Reed, every moment of suffocating panic when she was locked away.
Right, all that visceral detail.
Exactly, every freezing morning washing with ice-covered water. We felt her indignation. We felt her desperate desire to strike back again very hard.
Yeah.
So to then simply be told in just a paragraph or two that she absorbed Miss Temple's serenity over 8 years, it robs the reader of witnessing the actual mechanics of her survival.
It really does. It completely removes the friction. We are told she altered, but we don't get to see what it cost her to alter.
Yes. So the suggestion here is to dramatize these transitional years by illustrating the subtle, hard-won shifts in her temperament through an active, pivotal scene before Miss Temple's departure.
I love that. Instead of summarizing her time as a student and young teacher, we need concrete examples. Like write a specific scene showing the protagonist choosing restraint over her natural inclination for rebellion.
Oh, that's a great approach.
Right? For example, she could be faced with a difficult, insubordinate student of her own, like a child who intensely reminds her of her younger, frantic self.
Oh, wow. A mirror image?
Exactly. Show her actively suppressing the urge to react with the rapid rush of retrospective thought she felt in the Red Room, and instead show her deliberately employing the gentle, measured tones she learned from Miss Temple.
That's brilliant. This serves as a dynamic bridge between the passionate child and the composed young woman arriving at Thornfield.
Yeah, it forces the protagonist to confront a living mirror of her own past.
Let's play this out a bit. Imagine a scene where a young girl under her care throws a massive tantrum. Maybe even strikes out at her or throws a slate.
Right, directly echoing the John Reed dynamic but reversing the power roles.
Exactly. And the protagonist's immediate instinctual physiological reaction would be that old heat, the rising blood, the ringing in the ears, the absolute desire to retaliate or scream about the injustice of it all.
And that's where the tension lies. The reader knows her history intimately by this point. The reader is practically begging her to snap, because we remember how good it felt when she yelled at her aunt.
Oh yeah, we want her to fight back.
But instead, she has to physically swallow that heat. You could show her closing her eyes, taking a ragged breath, intentionally picturing Miss Temple's face, and, choosing a different path.
Right. And by showing her actively, painfully choosing to be calm, we understand that her new, composed demeanor isn't a magical personality transplant.
No, not at all.
It is a suit of armor she has painstakingly forged for herself, link by link. it makes her eventual arrival at Thornfield so much more compelling. Because we know that beneath her quiet, governess exterior, that blazing fire still exists. It is just tightly controlled.
It fundamentally changes how we view every interaction she has moving forward. When she is polite and submissive to Mrs. Fairfax or her new employer, we don't just see a passive character conforming to societal norms.
Right.
We see a character exercising immense, exhausting self-control. That is an incredibly active state of being, and it creates this simmering suspense, like we're constantly wondering, when is the armor going to crack?
Exactly. The restraint becomes a weapon she wields, rather than just a trait she possesses. So now, moving along that same thematic line of the friction of control, I want to transition from how the protagonist controls herself to how external forces try to control her.
Okay, let's get into it.
As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that the adults in her early life are deeply oppressive.
That makes sense, but could the evidence also support a different conclusion? Like giving these antagonists their own twisted moral high ground?
Oh, I see. The characterization of the early antagonists leans heavily into absolute villainy, which risks pushing the narrative into melodrama and dampening the psychological realism.
That's the real weakness here. Characters like Mr. Brocklehurst and Mrs. Reed are presented as purely malicious or grotesquely hypocritical.
Very black and white.
Yeah, Brocklehurst is introduced as a literal black pillar who justifies starving children while his own family arrives draped in velvet and ostrich plumes.
Right, it's very stark.
And Mrs. Reed is shown to be entirely devoid of any maternal conflict regarding her niece. This paints the protagonist's struggles in stark black and white, which can totally alienate a reader looking for a complex, grounded human friction rather than a fairy tale wicked stepmother dynamic.
I have to admit some confusion here, or maybe just a bit of pushback.
Sure, what are you thinking?
Well, I actually really loved how absolutely wicked Mrs. Reed was. It made me fiercely root for the protagonist right out of the gate. If we give her a moral high ground or make her sympathetic, don't we risk losing that visceral, fairy tale energy that makes the opening chapters so compelling and easy to latch onto?
I get that. But think about it. Giving these antagonists their own twisted moral high ground actually makes them more terrifying.
How so?
When an antagonist is cruel simply because they are evil, they cease to be a real human being and become a predictable plot device. We know exactly what the wicked stepmother is going to do.
Right, she's going to be wicked.
Exactly. But a human being who genuinely believes they are doing the right thing, or a human being driven by an irrational terror, they are entirely unpredictable. And unpredictability generates far more suspense than reliable malice.
I see where you're going with this. If Mrs. Reed locks a terrified child in a room where her husband died and feels absolutely no remorse, she's just a monster.
Right.
If Brocklehurst demands the girl's hair be cut off to mortify the lusts of the flesh while his own daughters sport elaborate curls, he's just a cartoon hypocrite. It works for a surface-level reaction, but it doesn't give the story the depth it needs to sustain a long Gothic narrative.
Precisely. We need to figure out how these villains justify their actions when they look in the mirror. No one thinks they're the villain of their own story.
So the suggestion is to infuse the antagonists with believable, albeit flawed, internal justifications for their cruelty to create a more sophisticated, chilling tension.
Yes. Let's brainstorm some concrete examples for this. Give Mrs. Reed a fleeting moment of genuine vulnerable superstition.
Oh, I like that.
When the protagonist screams in the Red Room, rather than Mrs. Reed thrusting her back in purely out of impatient, frantic anguish, show Mrs. Reed truly terrified that the child is a fiend or channeling her dead husband's spirit.
Wow.
Making her cruelty a product of profound fear rather than mere spite.
Oh, that shifts the dynamic entirely. Think about how much more unsettling Mrs. Reed becomes if you realize she isn't just a sadist, but a woman genuinely haunted by the deathbed promise she made to her husband.
Exactly.
If we see her hand visibly shaking on the key to the Red Room, not out of rage, but out of a superstitious dread that this strange alien child is somehow a curse on her house.
Yes, it makes her so much more real.
It doesn't excuse her abuse at all. In fact, it actually makes it scarier, because fear drives people to do far worse things than simple dislike ever could.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of Mr. Brocklehurst?
Okay, how would we handle him?
Show him making a difficult, budget-driven decision about the burnt porridge. Have him actively reviewing ledgers and convincing himself that the physical suffering of the girls is a necessary, unavoidable evil to keep the underfunded institution open.
Grounding it in the money.
Exactly. Making his hypocrisy a systemic failure rather than a cartoonish personal evil.
I love the idea of putting him at a desk with his ledgers. It grounds the horror in administration. Let the reader see him looking at the incredibly poor quality of the thread for the chemises or the rancid fat used for the food.
Right, the actual math of it.
And instead of just dismissing it with a villainous mustache twirl, have him internally rationalize the horrible math of the charity school. Have him truly believe that if he spends a single penny more on food, the school will bankrupt and close, and these girls will end up destitute on the streets.
Yes. So in his warped mind, feeding them burnt porridge is actually a horrific act of grace.
Oh, that's incredibly dark.
In regarding his own family wearing velvet and curls, he doesn't see it as hypocrisy. In his mind, his family represents the benefactors, the grace of God made manifest. They are the reward for righteousness, while the orphans must learn extreme humility because of their fallen station.
If he genuinely believes his own terrifying theology, his interactions with the protagonist become a clash of actual worldviews, rather than just a big bully picking on a small victim. When the antagonist thinks they are the hero, the protagonist's battle to survive them becomes infinitely more complex.
Exactly. It elevates the text from a simple melodrama into a profound psychological study.
So a key theme running through this material seems to be the conflict between earthly justice and divine endurance. We see this heavily when we shift our focus from the antagonists to the protagonist's primary ally, Helen Burns.
Yes, Helen is such a pivotal figure here.
She really is. And, thematic weight is like the anchor of a ship. It grounds the vessel beautifully, but if the chain is entirely let out all at once, the ship stops moving forward completely.
That's fascinating. What are the potential limitations or counterarguments to that idea of giving a young character such a heavy philosophical burden?
Well, the extended theological dialogues halt the narrative momentum and strain the natural voices of the young characters.
Yeah, that weakness is deeply tied to the pacing and the physical reality of the scene. Helen Burns' lengthy speeches about forgiveness, the New Testament, and the incorruptible spirit read like a polished philosophical treatise.
They really do. They're so dense.
Right. And while the themes of turning the other cheek versus the protagonist's desire to strike back again very hard are incredibly rich, delivering them through massive blocks of uninterrupted text bogs down the pacing of the lowered section.
It completely stalls it out.
It removes the reader from the visceral, freezing, starving reality of the school and places them into an abstract theological debate that feels inauthentic to the organic, fragmented conversation of a 14-year-old girl.
It really does feel like the manuscript occasionally forgets the brutal physical reality it has so perfectly constructed just a page prior. I mean, we have girls who are washing in ice, whose toes are raw and painfully swollen from chilblains, who are sharing tiny morsels of oatcake just to survive the night.
It's pure survival mode.
Exactly. And yet, amidst this total bodily deprivation, Helen speaks in perfectly constructed semicolon-laden, paragraph-long sentences about the impalpable principle of light and thought.
Right. You cannot speak in pristine, flowing paragraphs when your teeth are chattering. The ideas she is expressing are beautiful, but the delivery mechanism pulls us entirely out of the immersion of the scene.
It feels disconnected.
Speaking directly to the reader, rather than two starving children desperately trying to comfort each other in the dark.
So how do we fix it? We don't want to lose the philosophy because it's the core of her character.
No, we definitely want to keep it.
The suggestion is to anchor the philosophical and thematic debates deeply into the immediate physical action and sensory details of the scene, to make the dialogue feel earned, dynamic, and natural.
One way a writer might approach this is to provide concrete examples of her physical struggle. Break up Helen's long monologues by having her physical body continually betray her stoic words.
Oh, I like that contrast.
Right? While she is explaining her creed of eternity and a mighty home, have her abruptly racked by a hollow coughing fit. Or show her struggling to fold the untidy badge with chilblain-covered numb fingers.
Make it tactile.
Yes. Have the protagonist physically interrupt these speeches to rub Helen's freezing hands or offer her a stolen crumb of food. Instead of paragraphs of doctrine, translate Helen's high-minded ideals into brief, fragmented comforts spoken through chattering teeth.
That's so powerful.
It will completely heighten the tragedy of her situation while maintaining the narrative's forward momentum.
Let's workshop that specific scene by the fire where Helen first explains her philosophy. The protagonist is demanding to know why Helen doesn't fight back against Miss Scatcherd.
Right, the big debate.
Yeah, and Helen starts to explain her belief in quiet endurance. But instead of a pristine, uninterrupted monologue, what if she has to pause mid-sentence because the draft in the room is so severe she starts violently shivering?
Oh, that's fantastic.
What if she has to use em dashes and staccato phrasing because she literally doesn't have the breath to finish a long thought?
Is there a risk that focusing solely on the physical ailments might overshadow the theological points she's making?
I don't think so, because the physical vulnerability actually underscores the tragic irony of her philosophy. She is talking about possessing an incorruptible spirit while her corruptible body is literally failing her on the page.
That is such a good point.
It proves the necessity of her theology. If your body is failing that spectacularly, you have to believe in an incorruptible spirit just to survive the night.
Oh, that is brilliant. And it forces the protagonist to react not just to Helen's intellectual words, but to her immediate physical distress.
Yes, it makes it an active scene.
The protagonist might entirely disagree with the theology of turning the other cheek, but she can clearly see the suffering in front of her. If the protagonist wraps her own thin shawl around Helen's shoulders while Helen whispers these fragmented ideas of forgiveness, the thematic debate transforms into a highly charged physical interaction.
It grounds the abstract right back into the visceral. It reminds the reader constantly of the life and death stakes. Helen isn't just pontificating in a vacuum.
No, she's fighting to live.
She is desperately holding on to these beliefs as a literal survival mechanism against the freezing cold, the starvation, and the impending consumption.
By fracturing the dialogue with those sensory interruptions, the hollow cough, the numb fingers, the howling wind rattling the window panes, you maintain the relentless narrative pacing.
Exactly.
The scene is no longer just a convenient pause for a philosophical debate. It's a desperate, tactile moment of connection between two dying girls.
And think about how that makes Helen's eventual death so much more impactful. We haven't just been listening to a saint lecture us from a podium.
Right, we've been with her in the trenches.
We've been watching a terrified, freezing child physically waste away while clinging to her faith. It completely transforms the text from a stage play into a lived, breathing, agonizing reality.
The foundation of this narrative is incredibly strong. And by applying these adjustments to the pacing, character motivations, and thematic delivery, the material will hit with so much more resonance.
Absolutely. To elevate this deeply atmospheric manuscript, this critique has focused on three main pillars of structural and character development. First, dramatize the 8-year time jump. Rather than relying on passive exposition, craft an active scene that shows rather than tells the protagonist's hard-won emotional restraint, perhaps by having her manage a defiant student of her own to mirror her past.
Second, add psychological nuance to antagonists like Mrs. Reed and Mr. Brocklehurst. Ground their cruelty in genuine, believable fears or administrative pressures to avoid melodrama and increase the chilling unpredictability of their actions.
Finally, maintain the narrative pacing by breaking up the heavy theological dialogue. Anchor Helen Burns' philosophical themes in the visceral, physical realities of the freezing school, allowing her failing body to interrupt and highlight her stoic words.
These changes will make a huge difference.
They really will. The listener is highly encouraged to implement these actionable structural suggestions and to submit the revised work back in for a future critique. We really want to see how these scenes evolve once that friction is fully applied.